Welcome everyone to tonight's class, Basic Watercolor Techniques. I am your instructor, Adrienne Hodge, and tonight's class is very beginner-based, very intro level for watercolor, and I've been meaning to do a class like this for some time. We've done a lot of other watercolor classes, or I have done a number of watercolor classes for Michael's in the past. But this is the first time that we're doing just some basic techniques that can be applied to some watercolor painting. And next week, we're gonna do a class on sketching or drawing a purple passion flower. I'm getting my painting. It goes both ways. It can go this way or that way because I can't tell which way is this the top right now. I think it goes this way. Or maybe it does go the other way. Anyway, we're going to be drawing a purple passion flower next week. And then in the following week, we'll be doing this fun mixed media purple passion flower painting using watercolor and pen and ink and a little bit of gouache too. So look out for those classes. Next week's class will be drawing the purple passion flower, and we'll be breaking it down to its parts and zooming in, looking at the details, making sure that we really understand the ins and outs of that flower because it's a complicated one. And then the next week we'll be adding some watercolor, some of these same watercolor techniques that we're going to be using tonight. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and switch to my tabletop view and we'll go over supplies. But actually, before I do that, I've got a couple of supplies that I might as well just show you here instead of under my camera. So you're going to want those watercolors. Got this set, this Artist Loft set that comes in a lovely little carrying case here. And then I have the Iridescent set of Artist Loft watercolors. We're going to be playing around with those a little bit tonight. And I've got a bit of a melty situation inside of that pan. But then we're also going to be using some household items that you might have seen on the supply list. So you're going to want some table salt. Doesn't matter what kind of salt you have. Any kind of salt will do. And then we're going to want some alcohol because we're going to do a couple of fun techniques with those two things. And for the alcohol, if you want to grab a couple of Q-tips, maybe that would be good. Or maybe if you happen to have some droppers like this, that could be fun, something to easily drop the alcohol on the paper. All right, I'll switch to my tabletop view and go over the rest of the supplies here. But before I forget, don't forget to tag your work with the hashtags Make It With Michaels or Michaels Classes. You can follow me on Instagram at Adrienne Hodge Arts. I'm also on Facebook, Adrienne Hodge Fine Art. And here's some of my business cards. Some of my personal work on them. Okay, so you're gonna want some paintbrushes. I've got this set of Artist Loft watercolor paintbrushes here. And really, any watercolor paintbrushes that you have will work fine. I'm probably going to be using a flat brush like this quite a bit, and maybe a couple of different flat brushes and a couple of different round brushes. I mean, whatever brush you prefer, but I'll definitely be using a brush that looks like this, a nice big moppy flat brush. It can be big or small, depending on how big you want to make these little swatches that we're going to be making tonight. All right, I already showed you the watercolors. You're going to want a pencil or a pen so we can label these little tests that we're going to be doing. And a couple of water cups. I've got those off to the side. Paper towels, got those as well. And then the Artist Loft watercolor paper. I've got this 9 by 12 inch watercolor pad here by Artist Loft. And if you want some tape, you could tape your paper down so that it doesn't buckle. That could be an option. And then another option is if you have some plastic palettes on hand, you might want to grab those, but you can also do your washes that we're going to be making. You can easily do those in the lids, or sorry, not the lids. Well, yeah, the lid or the top of your watercolor set. So this don't know why I can't get it open. This area can be a perfect place to make your washes, or this part of your pan. But if you just happen to have some plastic palettes on hand that you want to use for making those washes, that would be a good idea. All right, any questions about supplies before I move on here? I'm not seeing any. Okay. So I'm going to get these examples. Well, actually, let me just go over everything we're going to cover tonight real quick. Maybe that'll answer some questions that may come up as we're going along in this process. And then, feel free to ask questions throughout as well. So we're going to be doing all these different washes with our watercolors. So we're going to do a wet on wet wash, and I'll explain what all of these things are as we go. Wet on dry wash, a variegated wash. We're going to be making a gradient. Results will vary, by the way. Your examples will look different, possibly than my examples. So if you end up with 4 or 5 sheets of paper because you want to try these multiple times, obviously that's fine. We're just making some examples and trying out some different techniques with watercolor tonight, and also trying to maybe perfect some of these techniques so that we can be better watercolor painters. So we'll do some dry brushing with water and then just some dry brushing. See what we think about that. We'll bleed some colors together. We'll try the salt and watercolor trick. We'll try the alcohol and watercolor trick. We'll do a black wash and then add some iridescent color on top of it. And the bleeding colors, I'm going to be using the iridescent colors as well. So you can see there's a little shimmer to those bleeding colors. And there's a shimmer to the iridescent color that I'm going to be adding on top of the black wash. If you don't have the iridescent watercolor paints, then that part will just be something that you won't exactly do in the same way, and that's fine. And then we're going to practice some layering because watercolor painting is all about layers. So we're going to do 1 layer and then leave it alone. We're going to do 2 layers, and each time we're going to be letting our layers completely dry before we add the second and third layer. And then we'll do 3 layers of some colors and see what happens when we layer all these colors on top of each other while also practicing letting each layer dry as we go, because that's a very important part of watercolor painting that a lot of people get impatient with. Okay, Corinne is saying she can barely hear me. Is anybody else having trouble hearing me? I guess let me know.
I did have a couple. I will go ahead and I'll put it in the main chat. I was responding to a few individually.
Oh, okay. I just turned my volume up. I don't know if that makes a difference. Several people are saying they can hear me just fine. Okay, good. All right, so we're gonna get started making some of these washes. I'm gonna just paint directly on my block here. So if you have the same sort of watercolor paper block, I suggest that you just leave it on the block and then we'll tear it off as we go. If you've got loose watercolor paper, then that's when you might want to go ahead and tape it down so that it doesn't buckle as we make these different washes. If it's on the block, then it shouldn't come off or buckle too badly. And we're not going to be going to the edge of the paper, so there's no reason to tape it unless you've got loose watercolor paper or you just prefer to have it taped down. You may know that about yourself. Okay, so I'm seeing Sarah saying she has cardstock paper. That should be okay-ish for testing out some layers. You might have some issues when we do multiple layers towards the end here, or you might have issues if you add too much water to cardstock. So watercolor paper is basically made to handle water weight, and it'll tell you the this number here. It'll say a number and then pounds. So like mixed media paper is, I believe, usually around 85 pounds. That's how much water weight it can handle. And sometimes, you know, just depending on the watercolor paper weight, it's going to buckle more quickly. So that may happen with any paper that's not watercolor paper. So just know that that might be an issue for you. You could use mixed media paper, would work just fine for this though, if you didn't have watercolor paper for anybody else. Okay. Oh, of course, my cat wants to come visit me on my desk right now. She is not invited. I really hope she will leave me alone. No, ma'am. Okay. All right, so we're going to use whatever colors you prefer as we go along here. You're welcome to use the same colors as me. So the first thing we're going to do is this wet on wet wash. So that means that we are going to paint a layer of water first, and then we're going to add our wash of a color onto that. And then the next one we're going to do is a wet on dry wash, which means we're just going to do a wash without adding water first. But both of these washes are called flat washes, and I should add that on here, flat wash. So it's a wet on dry flat wash, and it's a wet on wet flat wash. And the reason it's called a flat wash is because you ideally want to get it to where it appears flat when it dries and it doesn't have a lot of striations or stripes in it. But those natural striations and stripes that may sometimes happen, like it happened right here on my gradient and on my variegated wash, those aren't necessarily bad, but a lot of people don't want them there. So the easiest way to get them to not be there is to try to get your wash to be as flat as possible when you lay it down the first time. And sometimes that takes a lot of practicing. So we're going to practice it now. Let's go ahead and make our wash first, and then we will paint our area with just water. So it's good to have two water cups. That way, one of your water cups can be, you know, clean water to start here. Is it, someone's asking, is it possible to show us the paint palette while you're painting? Yes, I'm going to try to get all those things on screen at the same time. We'll see if it can happen throughout the class. It maybe will not, but I'll do my best. Okay, so yeah, we're gonna make our wash first, and then we'll paint our little area with just our water. So I'm gonna go ahead and label this one our wet on wet flat wash. Oh my gosh. All right, so the key word in watercolors that a lot of people miss, which it sounds like I'm being facetious, but I'm really not, is water. It's right there in the name of the medium. Yeah, a lot of people just don't use enough of it when they're painting with watercolors. So if what we're about to do ends up not looking flat, it's probably because your initial wash that you're making does not have enough water in it. So I'm going to use one of these little mixing palettes that I have here. You could do it here in the tray as well, but I'm just worried about spillage because I've got a slanted desk here. So I'm also going to take my little pipette that I have here and just drip water directly from my water cup into here and just get a nice little puddle going. You don't have to have one of these, but if you happen to, then you could do this as well. Otherwise, you're just going to take your paintbrush and your water cup and just keep dripping water until you get a puddle of water in there. Okay, and then we're going to take any of our paintbrushes, doesn't matter which one, and add some color here. So I'm just going to use a blue. Like I said, you can use whatever color you want. And I'm just adding some water to get my paintbrush moving in this blue and really soak up some blue here. And then I'll add it to my little puddle of water. All right, and then that paintbrush is going in my water cup for now. And I'm going to take one of my flat paintbrushes here and my clean water cup now, my clean water, and I'm just going to paint stripes of water. And maybe you can round it out like I did. I kind of dragged the water around and made this soft little rounded square. And you just have to look to see where you're painting it. And you don't need too much water because you don't want it to bleed too much, but you want it to just be this nice, even layer. Okay, so now I'm going to take my paintbrush and I'm going to really soak it up there. Maybe I'll add a little bit more color to this. This is a little too washy. Sometimes I'm like trying to exaggerate my points so much that I make mine a little too watery. So you don't want it too thin, but you definitely want a little puddle there. Okay, so I got that all loaded up. And then maybe have your paper towel nearby just in case you got it too wet. And then you're just going to paint stripes down into your little square here. And you might get some more watercolor on your brush as you go. And resist the urge to paint into it too much. So I do see a few little stripes in there, but I'm going to leave it alone because if I keep messing with it, I'm likely to make the stripes worse. And then you might have a little puddle that collects at the edge there, and that is fine. When that dries, it's not going to be quite as noticeable. I'm really just catching mine because I don't want it to drip down my page because again, my desk is on a slant. So this might not be happening to you if you don't have a drafting table. But you can just take your paper towel and just touch it to the edge and let it soak up like that. But here's what it looks like when it dries. Those little puddles at the edge just create like a fun little effect. And it's not bad. There's really no good or bad to any of these brush strokes or techniques. It's really what you prefer or what effect you're going for. All right, so we're going to leave that alone and let that dry. I'm already regretting touching it too much with the paper towel and not just letting it do its own thing there at the edge, and then my solution is to touch it even more. See, I'm doing exactly what I want y'all not to do. Don't mess with it, because see how it's starting to dry in a way that feels really flat? If I had not trusted that and I had done another layer and kept painting into it, I might be creating a not flat wash. So you really have to trust that it's going to dry flat if you leave it alone. And the only issue I really have is what happened where I touched it with my paper towel too much, but I could also tell it was about to drip. So choices were made. Okay, so
Question, Adrienne.
yeah.
Someone's asking if there's too much water, is that the reason why it's dripping out of the square shape?
Great question. No, and I see that Deb actually answered that for me. Thank you, Deb. No, it's because my surface is on a slant. If it hadn't been on a slant, it probably would have just collected like this. The gravity would have done its job of just keeping it right there, and it would have pooled up and created a little pool. But since I'm on a slant, the gravity was dragging it down. But if I had been on a flat surface, I'm starting to think I need to readjust this drafting table so that it's not so slanted. I like it to be on a slant for myself personally, but then when I'm teaching, there are these issues. I'm going to grab some little Post-its here and see if I can get it to be, and do the old, sweet and low packet under the table leg. See if I can get it to be a little more flat. So yeah, by keeping it flat, you should get a nice flat wash, like how I tied that in there. All right, so now let's do the wet on dry wash, which basically means we're not going to paint the water first. Okay, so this is a wet on dry wash, meaning our paper is dry. And I forgot to add the word flat again. Okay, so we already have our little wash of blue, so we can just use that same color. I'm just going to load it up and then do that same thing, but without the water underneath. So we're trying to just drag it around. I like to start at the top and then halfway through go to the bottom and then meet myself somewhere in the middle. And you want to do it really fast and just get it filled in. And if there's a gap in there, I would just leave it. And then, yeah, since I didn't do a little too much water that time and I've got my paper more flat, I think I maybe painted too much water at first too. And that's another reason that drip was happening. But I recall when I did this one, that happened as well, but it just pooled up in the corners. So like I said, you might have to do it a few times. When I do this in person in classes with people for the first time ever, oftentimes it takes them a few tries. Okay, so don't be discouraged if it takes you a few tries to get a flat wash to actually happen, because one, you might be using too much water. Two, you might not have enough water. Or three, you might be painting into it multiple times and not leaving it alone. So you got to trust that if you paint it quickly, fill in that area, and then stop, use some self-control, you shouldn't have those issues. Okay, but sometimes it does take several tries for people to get it. So if it's not happening for you, those are the three variables that are probably getting in your way. Deb had the question. Oh, Vicky's asking, how do you keep the stripes from happening? So you keep the stripes from happening by working quickly and making sure that you have an even amount of water to color ratio. So you want your pigment and your water to be sort of balanced. You don't want it to be too wet. You don't want it to be too dry. And you want to do it quickly and you want to leave it alone. So you notice I painted that area. I dragged the paint around, filled it in, stopped. Didn't go back over it a second time. Didn't go back over it a third time. So if you're getting the stripes, you either went too fast, you went too slow, your paint was too wet, your paint was too dry. Okay, so it takes a few tries, like I said. And then Deb saying, why would you choose one over the other? That's a great question. Really, it's personal preference. Oftentimes, I will do it if I'm trying to fill in a background really quickly. I'll do the wet on wet because I can usually get that to happen nice and fast. And then if I've got like a large area to cover, I would do wet on wet because most of the time your initial stripes may be drying before you can get to the bottom of the page if you've got a large area and you're trying to do a wet on dry wash. So for a small area, I would do wet on dry. And for a large area, I would do wet on wet. But sometimes I just do wet on wet because I like the way it looks better. I like those little pools that happen at the edges. And that's more likely, although it kind of happens on both of them. So I don't know. It's really preference. A lot of this is your personal preference. And I always like to say in a lot of classes, and since you're asking, which one you would prefer, when you would use what, that's a question that I get a lot from beginners in a lot of the classes that I teach. And I love to say how when you're beginning a new hobby like painting, it's like you're dating yourself. And I'm just going to switch to my forward facing camera since I'm just talking for a second. It's like when you're single and you're dating, a new person, you don't know anything about them. You don't know what their likes and dislikes are. You don't know what their favorite music is, what their favorite food is, what their favorite anything is, right? You have to learn all that about them. Well, beginning a new hobby like drawing or painting, you are dating yourself. So you don't know what your favorite paintbrush is. You don't know if you prefer a wet on wet flat wash or if you prefer a wet on dry flat wash. So you have to take yourself out on a few dates and figure that out. So it's really not up to me to tell you what you prefer in your painting process. So that's what we're trying out tonight is a bunch of different techniques so you can see what you prefer and which processes you might like to use when you're painting. And then there are certain processes that are going to get you a certain effect. But again, you kind of don't know that in regards to what you would prefer in certain situations until you try them all in different situations. All right, so we're going to move on to the variegated wash, although actually there was another question up there I wanted to answer before I move on. What was it?
We
How
had
did
a
I?
couple, what is your favorite brand of paint? Do you
Artist
also
Loft is my favorite brand of watercolor paint. Um, and oh yeah, sorry, Rich, did you want to read the questions?
I'll grab them for you. Um, what is your favorite brand of paint, and how did you get your, do you set up your blue again?
Oh,
Someone was asking when you were mixing your there you go.
yeah, I just used a little eyedropper that I have here, a little pipette to get a little puddle of paint in there, but you can also just take your paintbrush and just keep dripping water from your paintbrush, although I just dripped a bunch on my paper as I did that. Um, don't do it over your paper and just keep dripping it in there until you get a puddle and then you add your color to it, your pigment. And then Leslie's asking, do you usually only need one coat? It depends on what you're doing. So if that is sufficient to say paint a blue sky, then you might be okay with that. It depends on what you're painting and what kind of, what you're looking for there. We are going to practice adding multiple layers here towards the end. Okay. Oh, thank you, Rebecca. And sorry, I'm not sure what that how to pronounce that username. But it's saying they like that analogy. Appreciate it. Okay, so let's move on to the variegated wash. I'm gonna write that. So variegated means that it starts out one thing, turns into another thing. So I'll just use the same colors that I used last time just so that I don't have to make new decisions here. Uh, so I had purple and then blue. You can use any colors you prefer for this. Oh, bumping my camera. I'm just going to take my eyedropper and make a little wash of purple. You can just drip with your paintbrush into your water cup if you need to. And then use my violet. Might be kind of fun to use red on one end and then maybe they turn violet in the middle. In fact, I'm gonna add a little red to this and make it more of a red violet. All right, I'm just gonna use this paintbrush because I have it here already, just a round brush. We're just gonna do a similar sort of thing. We're gonna paint some stripes down and I might re-dip my paintbrush a few times here and drag it around a little bit and then clean my brush or get a different brush. Also, I'm having my little issue is happening again because of gravity. And then I'm going to take my clean paintbrush and start at the bottom with my blue and drag that up and then let them bleed together, which because of my because of my slanted table surface, that just really bled together more than I wanted it to. It became more of like a bleeding colors. Let me try that one more time. I'm going to hold my, I mean, it's a cool effect, but that's not exactly what I was going for. So
What's this technique called again, Adrienne?
it is the variegated wash. Okay, so I'm painting with the violet from the top down, and then I'm going to take the blue and go from the bottom up. And then that's what I'm looking for when they touch. They're gonna switch. So they sort of bleed together a little bit. Maybe you could like paint into the stripe a little bit if it bothers you. So I would just leave it alone and just let that dry. The only thing I'm gonna do is try to soak up my puddle here so I don't have to keep holding my paper, and I can leave it alone. That top one actually did end up pretty nice. Yeah, the main thing, if I could download any ability into you all right now, because I'm willing to bet the majority of the issues are happening from messing with it. So the main ability I want to give you is the ability to leave it alone, to let it dry, to not mess with it. In all of the water media classes that I teach, watercolor, gouache, ink painting, which is my specialty, I always joke in my in-person classes. I've been teaching adults for 10 years now, and adults can be sometimes more impatient than kids. And so I'll joke to them, like pull out my school teacher isms and say, let me know if you need something to do while you're waiting for that layer to dry. You could walk around, you could talk to the other people in the class, you could scroll on your phone, you could go get a cup of coffee, you could go to the bathroom. I usually recommend that people will paint multiple things at once. That way they can do something with that anxious energy while they're waiting for one layer to dry. But people often report that they have an easier time waiting for layers to dry when they paint by themselves at home. So I think there's just something about being in a class that makes you want to like constantly be doing something. And you'll notice like I'm chatting a lot and I'm kind of, building in like a dialogue into this class tonight. I have to do that because we have to wait for these layers to dry. So if while I'm sitting here just talking to you and letting these layers dry, you're constantly messing with your variegated wash, you're adding to it, you're not leaving it alone, you're not letting it dry, then you're probably like, why doesn't mine look like yours? Well, it's because I'm leaving mine alone. And if you're not leaving it alone, that's why. So you've got to let it dry. That's the first rule of watercolor, is let each layer dry before you move on to the next one. And any watercolor teacher will tell you that. And it's the number one thing that students have a hard time with, that and not adding enough water to it.
We have a
Okay,
good question, Adrienne. How dry is dry?
that's a great question. If you can touch it with your hand and it's not cold, and it's not coming off on your hand, it doesn't feel cold and wet, then it's dry. Uh, yeah. So it's like right now I can tell if I touch, it's also shiny when it's wet. So like right now, if I were to touch it with my finger or my paper towel, I can tell I would pull some out of it because I can tell it's still wet. And you can lift it back out once it's dry too. So if there's something about it you don't like, you might lift it out once it's dry. You might, I mean, it's never going to be the same as it could have been if you let it dry first. Or sorry, if you, what am I trying to say? I mean, you'll see what happens when you mess with it in different ways, but you really never know what could happen if you leave it alone until you leave it alone. It does a lot of cool stuff on its own. And then the other thing is that you can always add another layer to it. So you're going to see like how cool it's going to look when we let each layer dry and add multiple layers to it, as opposed to impatiently messing with each layer as you go. And like, look at how cool this is looking since I'm leaving it alone. As it's drying, it's doing a lot of really neat stuff all by itself. I would never know this could happen if I kept messing with it. So, okay. Yeah, and I see Shannon saying she bumped hers and it with a fingerprint and it looks kind of cool. Yeah, lots of cool things can happen. That's what tonight's all about, is seeing what happens when we do these different effects. All right, let's move on to a gradient. So a gradient is just going from dark to light. And we're going to do that by just starting with a color and then just dragging it down the page with water. You can use either one of the colors you already have or get a new color. It's up to you. I am going to add a little bit of watercolor pigment to this just to make it a little thicker. So I'm just dipping in my blue here and making it a little thicker. That way I can start with a pretty not too diluted blue, and then I'm going to add water to dilute it and drag it down the page to get that gradient to happen. And when you're painting a sky, using a gradient so that the top of the sky is darker blue and then it gets lighter blue towards the bottom of the sky, that's a great way to create a sky. Okay, so I'm just going to start with the blue and I'm just going to paint stripes down. And then once I start, I mean, it might just happen naturally from just running out of the blue. But once it starts to run out here, I'm just going to dip my paintbrush in some water and just keep dragging that down with just water. And this is the one where you're most likely to get some stripes to happen. So you might go back up into the stripes a little bit, you know, and try to get them to like bleed down. But if you do that too much, you'll end up with a weird stripey thing like I did with my last one. So, you know, they can't all be perfect examples. But like if this were a sky, I could easily do this to ease my stripes. I could take my paper towel and like strategically pull some out in some places where it might be like clouds. That could be fun. It's another extra little trick there for you if you're getting stripes and you don't like them. But again, if your gradient doesn't turn out perfect the first time, you can wait for it to dry and you can do another layer on top of it and maybe get the next layer of the gradient to be a little more seamless. But like here, I have a weird striation in it. That doesn't bother me. I like to let materials do what materials do. I try not to force my agenda on my materials too much and just pretend like whatever happened was what I meant to do. And I recommend that attitude. Okay, so there's our gradient. Now we're going to do some dry brushing with water and some dry brushing without water. So, and that is definitely still wet over here because it's cold. And I just put my hand on top of it. I could see
Speaking of, we have a few impatient individuals that want to know, can they use a blow dryer
okay.
to dry it a little faster if they want to keep working?
Did you want to share the questions, Rich?
Oh, can you hear me? Oh,
Oh,
can you hear me?
oh, you froze up for a second.
Am I back?
Yeah, I can hear you now. I wonder if I froze.
A few folks are wondering, can they use a blow dryer if they want to move a little faster?
Yes, you could definitely use a blow dryer, but we're not doing second layers to any of this. So shouldn't be any issues unless you're left-handed like me and you're putting your hand in it as you're going along. Oops, I had a wrote dry wash instead of dry brush. Okay, so we're
And
gonna
then
do
we're wondering if the gradient and variegated, the last two that you did, are those all dry, or did you use wet on dry, or was it a dry wash?
uh yeah, this was all dry paper. The only one I did the wet on wet thing was the first one.
Awesome.
Okay, so we're gonna do a dry brush and then we're gonna add water and we're gonna do just a dry brush. And I'll explain what that is as we go. Okay, so I mean it's not too mysterious here. First I'm gonna take my dry brush and I am just going to like load it up with one of these colors and I might add a little bit of water or actually, yeah, just a tiny bit of water. Like this one already has a little bit of water in it. So I might get just like a little bit of water, but mostly I'm going in with a dry brush and I just like touched this little puddle and then, just to get it moving because it's not going to come out of there if it doesn't have a little bit of water on it. But I'm going to really soak up as much pigment as I can without water on it. So get it nice and kind of slimy on your brush like that. So I didn't add any additional water other than just the water that I used to be able to move it around. So it's going to be pretty dry. And then we're going to paint both of these at the same time. So we're just going to paint a little area with just that dry brush and you're going to get this to happen, which like I said, is not bad. You might like this effect. There could be plenty of times when you're painting that you want this dry, scratchy thing to happen. And I will admit, I have been the kind of art teacher in the past that has pushed my own preferences on people. And I used to say I didn't like the way that looked and that was bad. But I've changed my mind, especially since doing so much abstract painting. That texture that happens with a dry brush can be really fun. So who am I? And you might love it as well. So just because I had an acquired taste for it that took me a while, um, you might like it already. So it's not necessarily bad or good or anything. It's just maybe you want that texture, and that might be a cool thing to do. Okay, but most of the time that's happening when people want this. They want this and this is happening. It's like, okay, well, we need more water, right? But this is a cool thing. So we started with the dry brush on both of these, and then this one we're going to add some water to it. So I'm just going to take a clean brush, not the one that has all that blue on it. So I'm just taking another clean brush and I'm just dipping it in my water here. And then I'm just gonna add water and see what cool things happen when I add water to this dry brushed area. A lot of cool things happen. So this bleedy thing happens. You get this really fun texture. You get this really solid dark to happen. So that could come in very handy in your painting process. All right, so that's one page down and we'll see how different that might look when it's dry. It might have some cool little effects like this when it dries because the water might seep into and get those little kind of needly things to happen. Right. I'm going to pull this page off of my block and get started on the next page. Although I'm trying to do it without messing up that last effect. I'm gonna make it do a different kind of thing just because I'm pushing it around, but that's what happens when you don't have time to wait. I'm recognizing where we are in our 90 minutes right now. Okay, so I'm gonna set that aside. And the next one we're gonna do is our bleeding colors. This is a fun one. So I'm gonna play around with these iridescent colors here. Yeah, don't leave your watercolors in the car, folks. That's what'll happen in the Texas heat. But they still work. They're just, we got a little unicorn poop happening here. Okay, so and you'll tell that I have a third grader and a sixth grader. My sense of humor is very unicorn poop centric here. Okay, so we're gonna just bleed the colors together. So we're gonna make some watery washes of 3 different colors, and we're gonna use a round brush like this, and we're going to just kind of stipple or dab them in, and we're gonna let them bleed together, and it's gonna happen really quickly. And you know, if I go too fast and your effect doesn't happen exactly the way you want it to, you might have to try it a few times. So first I'm just gonna make a little, not quite as big as those last washes. Just gonna do 3 little puddles like this, and then take a round brush, and I'll use maybe violet and blue and green together here. So first make a little puddle of the iridescent violet. And you can do this with any colors. They don't have to be the iridescent colors. I just wanted to play around with these. And then I'll use some pink or red violet. Although it's got a little gold in it as well.
Adrian, do the colors in general, is there a hard and fast kind of rule that they dry lighter or darker? Um, or do they say the same?
Oh, that's a good question. So with watercolor, they tend to dry lighter than when they first go on. Those of you who maybe have come to my gouache classes, we did a class like this for gouache where we went down a few pages of practice, different techniques with gouache. And during that class, I talked about how gouache will dry, like darker layers will dry lighter, lighter layers will dry darker, which is a really interesting quality that gouache has. But with watercolor, they're always going to dry lighter than when you put them on. So that's another reason to leave them alone and let them dry before you make a decision about how you feel about it. A lot of people just get so impatient and they don't like how it looks when it's wet, so they keep messing with it, and they maybe would have liked it if they would have let it dry. All right, let me label this. I'm very on edge because I had a water spill on this desk earlier. And just like keep thinking I'm going to do it again. Okay, so I've got those 3 different colors there. I'm just gonna stipple them in like little dots. And I'm gonna go kind of quickly. And I'm really letting it pool. So I'm letting a little puddle happen because I want those little puddly moments to happen, those like edges to dry and get some fun little, you know, collected stuff to happen in the corners. And I would do that even if you're not using the the iridescent colors. And then I just cleaned my brush a little bit and then doing the purple kind of next to it at first. And then I'll just touch them and let them bleed together. Maybe let there be some gaps in between them. And like, yeah, really let them bleed. Like if they touch in a few places, it's pretty similar to the variegated wash, except we're really letting them bleed together. And then I'll do the blue, and I'm just letting those drips and those natural bleedy things, just letting them happen. We're just seeing what happens when we do different stuff. And you can maybe add some water, let them bleed with water, like just drip some water into them. And again, you'll never know what could happen if you just let these layers dry. If you keep messing with them, you're going to, make it different. I did just take more of like the pure purple and touch it in there and let that bleed. So once it gets nice and wet and bleedy, if you want to do a little bit of that. So I'm just taking more of the direct watercolor and touching it and letting it bleed in. With all three colors, I'm doing that. I'm watching what happens when I do kind of a dry on wet effect there. I mean, there are plenty more techniques. These aren't all the watercolor techniques that we could do in 90 minutes. These are just the ones that I chose. You're welcome to look up watercolor effects and techniques. I think I found a list of like over 30 of them when I was looking for some ideas for this class. So there's many more than the ones that we're doing. And I'm just using my paper towel because I don't want it to drip. But that's a pretty cool bleeding colors effect. Okay, so now let's do the salt thing. This is fun. A lot of elementary art teachers love to do this one with kids because it's a really easy way to get a snowy sky to happen or to get an effect that's just pretty fail proof. So we're just going to paint with our watercolors. We're going to paint a wash and then we're going to drop some salt in. And then you guessed it, we're going to leave it alone. And the beautiful thing about teaching kids is that you can do something like that and then take it away from them and put it on the drying rack and be like, that was fun and now it's done. And then we wait for it to dry. But with adults, you have to use self-control. And I'm not there to take it away from you. So trust the process, folks. All right, so let's get one of our nice flat brushes. And I'm just going to use my blue since it's handy right here. And I'm just going to paint some stripes. Resist the urge to keep painting stripes and just let whatever happens happen there. I'm going to take some salt.
Are you using the same brush for every color, Adrienne? Or are you rinsing it out after each color or?
I'm using a few different brushes, but yeah, I'm cleaning it out before I go cleaning it and then drying it on my paper towel before I go to a new color. But I do have a whole bunch of brushes here, so I honestly have used a lot of brushes just to not have to waste time cleaning them. Okay, so I've got a little puddle there. I'm gonna let that puddle be there. And I'm just pinching my salt and then letting it. You got to do it kind of fast while it's still wet. So the puddle is good because the salt is going to soak up the watercolor. That's what's happening. And I maybe waited a little too long, but I'm definitely going to have a cool effect down here where it dries in the puddly area. This one, I definitely dropped it on a lot faster. and that's how it looked. But again, you have to wait for it to completely dry to get that cool little tie-dye thing. And I used a lot of salt on this one, like I did here. So we'll see what that looks like when it's dry. We'll move on to the alcohol effect next. This one is so fun. I remember doing this in like March or April 2020 with my daughter, and it was very entertaining in the peak quarantine times, especially because that was, I don't know, the age that she was at the time. That was just the perfect age. She was very fascinated with this. Entertained us for a while one afternoon. Okay, so I'm going to take some alcohol and put it in my little dish that I have here. If you don't want to pour the alcohol into a dish, you could just dip your Q-tip into your alcohol bottle. You really don't need that much alcohol to do this. Okay, so I got my little Q-tip ready, and I'll just do blue again. Or no, I'll do my purple because it's right here too. So I'm just gonna paint some stripes with a different color or the same color. And let's maybe go ahead and get this to be like a nice little flat wash here. Dragging it around mostly to keep it from dripping. And then while it's still wet, I'm gonna take the alcohol and just touch it. It's gonna do this fun little resist effect. It's gonna bleed into it and create like what you're seeing right now. That's what's gonna happen. And the more alcohol you use, the more dramatic it will be. And then again, we gotta leave it alone and let it dry. You could kind of, I don't know, you gotta be careful what you do with alcohol. You know, you don't want to inhale it too much. It might irritate you. So go easy with it, but all right. So while we're waiting for those two to dry, I'm gonna be very strategic not to put my hands in any of those. And we'll do a black wash with iridescent color. And while I was, you know, creating this test sheet, I tried out a few different things, and this was just a cool one. And I was like, well, that'll be a fun one to do in the class, in case you're wondering, how did I come up with that decision? It could
You have
be,
a couple folks
yeah, go
couple
ahead.
folks asking the salt technique that you're using in these different interesting effects that you have. Are those mostly used for backgrounds, or where would you utilize those in a painting? And someone's asking if there will be a follow-up to this class where you'll show us an actual, help to do an actual painting using these techniques.
Yeah, so the example I showed at the beginning of the class, in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be doing this purple passion flower painting together. So definitely some of these techniques will come up in this one. So like you could even use the salt effect on this to create some interesting effects if you wanted. You could maybe do, I mean, this is like a pretty loose painting that we're going to do. So you could, I mean, honestly, you use these effects wherever you think they might look cool. We're doing a lot of different effects tonight. Some of these are just like basic techniques you use constantly. in watercolor painting. So, you know, a flat wash or a variegated wash. Um, all of these would come up in landscapes pretty often. If you were doing some abstract stuff, you might do that dry brush and water. It would create some interesting textures. Bleeding colors together would definitely come in handy, you know, when painting maybe a flower. If you were looking at a flower that had petals that have like on a rose, it might look like colors are bleeding together on the petal of a rose. So you might use it then. Like I said before, if you wanted a snowy sky, the salt is a cool way to make that happen. The alcohol could even lend itself to bubbles or a snowy sky. These are all just things you can use in these are basic watercolor techniques. So a lot of them come up quite frequently in the process of watercolor painting, and other ones, you know, you just kind of use them wherever you think they would be useful. But I'll definitely be, I mean, I've done several other watercolor classes over the last 3 years with Michael's as well. So if you wanted to Google watercolor and my name, you'll see some of those other classes and you'll see me using some of these techniques in those. Okay. Let's see, how are we doing on time? Oh, okay, we still have 25 minutes. I just want to make sure we have time for those layers because we're going to need to let each layer dry for the 1, 2, and 3 layers. Okay, so let's get a wash of black going. You could use another darker color. I just found the gold showed up really nicely on this black, so that's what I went with. Okay. Sometimes it's hard to tell which one is the black in this. There we go. Oh, that's the brown. It would probably look cool on dark blue or brown or black, any of these that are showing up black in your kit. I'm going to go ahead and make a little wash of black. Okay, so we're going to need this to dry completely before we do the gold on top. Oh, this is more of my dark blue. Hard to tell. Yikes. It's fine. The gold will show up on the dark blue just as much here. I got more of like an indigo wash here. All right, and then we're just gonna let that dry. And while we're letting that dry, we'll move on to this example of doing 1 layer, 2 layers of color, and 3 layers of colors. But we're gonna paint our first layer all the same color. I'm gonna use blue. So for my first layer, for my 1 layer example, I'm gonna do blue. And it's just basically like a flat wash, but I kind of painted the stripes and just let them be however they were gonna be. All right, and then I did that for all 3 of these. So I'm about to paint a blue wash and label them 1 layer, 2 layers, 3 layers. Then this one, we're gonna leave it alone and have it just be that 1 layer of whatever color you use. And then with this one, I'm gonna add my red violet on top of it once it's dry. And then on this one, I'm gonna add, oh wait, I did yellow first and then blue and then brown here. So I labeled what I did. I told y'all I did some separate sheets where I tried out a lot of different things. Okay, so I'm gonna paint blue here twice, and then I'm gonna start with yellow on this 3rd layer. So that way we can see what happens when we add blue to the yellow and get green, but we're gonna let each layer dry first. So you can try this other ways. You can try yellow and then blue on top to make green when it's wet, but you're going to get a different kind of effect. But just to see what happens, because I really, want you all to see the benefits of letting each layer dry. Okay, so I'm just cleaning this out because I'm done with those colors for now. And I'm just trying to make some room on my desk. I'm still waiting for that black to dry. So we'll go back and do that iridescent color when that one's totally dry. I might go ahead and pull some of this out with my paper towel. Just soak it up a little. Okay, so you label one layer. Two layers. And 3 layers. And I'll go ahead and write what colors I'm going to use for these. So I'm going to do blue, blue plus red, violet. And then here I'm going to do yellow, blue, and brown. Obviously, you can try this with any combination of colors. The main idea here is we're letting each layer dry before we do the next layers on top of them. I'm really trying to convince you that letting each layer dry is the optimal way to paint with watercolor. Okay, so I got my little flat brush here. And I'm just painting some stripes of blue. I mean, we've already seen what happens when we paint one layer and leave it alone before, but maybe you didn't leave it alone. So this is forcing you to do that. And then this one, I'm kind of squeezing it in here in a smaller space than I did before. And then, so we're just leaving those alone. So I want to paint yellow first here. So first I'm just making a little wash of yellow. Well, both of my water cups are pretty blue now, so I might be accidentally turning this yellow green. All right. We're going to see what happens when we let those layers completely dry before we do anything else. And while we're waiting for those to dry, we can go back to our salt and say, hey, is our salt dry yet? Mine is half dry and half still wet. So like right here, I can tell it's dry, but at the bottom it's still wet. So I'm gonna leave it alone and wait a little longer. And my iridescent, my black wash that I want to put the iridescent on. Nope, it's still wet too. Okay, let's see. Are there any questions I can answer while I'm waiting?
A couple of questions. One person is saying Gloria is saying most of my stripes are not turning to a solid color.
Okay, so if that's happening, it's probably because, well, I don't know. I'm just going to ask you directly, Gloria. Are you painting a layer and then leaving it alone, or are you going back into it every time you paint your stripes? Let me scroll down. You can see Gloria's answer.
She hasn't responded. Oh, there she. One layer, she says.
Okay. Then it's either that you have too much water or not enough water. So try it a few, or you might be going kind of slow. Sometimes you got to go kind of fast and just fill in that area as quickly as possible. You want a pretty even ratio of water and color. You don't want it to be too puddly and you don't want it to be too dry. Because like, see, I did those pretty quick And like, look at how beautifully flat that's drying. I'm not seeing any stripes there. I'm not seeing any stripes here either. I do have a puddle at the bottom. But if you do it nice and quick, and also like load up your brush. So like get your brush. Sometimes, yeah, actually that does happen sometimes in classes, and then I'll go over and be like, are you really letting the brush soak it up? And sometimes in person, I can help people troubleshoot with that. Like it might just be that you're not doing that. Or you might not have a moppy enough brush. So these Artist Loft watercolor brushes are all pretty moppy, but sometimes people will have, let me see if I have one on my desk that might be similar. You know, they might have a watercolor brush that's just not very moppy. Like, is this a watercolor brush? Yeah, this is a watercolor brush, but I don't know. I mean, just if it's small and it's not like soaking up enough uh, paint. So like really get it in there and let it mop it up, you know. That way you can paint your stripes quickly because you don't have to re-dip. That could be it. I've had a woman in the class recently who was struggling like that, and I just gave her one of my brushes. And it happened to be the Artist Loft brushes. And she was like, wow, these are working so much better because they were moppier than the brush she was using.
Vicky's wondering, what is the best way to clean your brushes?
You just need a little soap and water, maybe not even soap sometimes. Just, you know, like with kids, I always say, think about your toothbrush. You wouldn't, you know, reuse your toothbrush if it still had, you know, food on it or toothpaste. So you just rinse it till the color is totally out of the brushes. If you lay it on a paper towel and it's still bleeding, you know, green or something onto your paper towel, then it's not clean. But watercolor is pretty easy to clean off of brushes. A little soap and water. Okay, I think I'm ready to do my iridescent on top of this. This is pretty dry. So I'm just going to take one of these liner brushes, one of these skinny brushes here, and I'm going to use the gold. So I'm just going to get some water on my paintbrush and then really mop it up with this liner brush. Just get it really saturated on the brush because I really want it to be nice and thick and direct. So not a whole lot of water, but I got that water moving around and got it really soaked up on there. And then we're just gonna make some fun little dots. And as long as it's nice and thick, so this could be stars in a sky, could be some fun iridescent clouds on a night sky, lots of different fun stuff you could do like this. If you're painting a butterfly, you could play around with these iridescent colors on some darker background washes or different layers like this, and you could get some really fun effects with that. And again, you want to let it dry before you judge it. Okay. And yeah, maybe we'll add a little water to this and like let it bleed on top of that black and see how fun like a wet on wet effect could be with this, or a dry on wet. How those little sparkles can bleed into the wet layer. So that could be fun to let them bleed a little bit. Okay. And then while we were doing all that, hopefully our little layers over here are drying. So if the paper is buckling and kind of creating a bubble, like I've got a bubble right here, that also tells me that it's still wet. This one's kind of got a bubble too. They both do. Uh, how much time do we have? This is where I'm like, I do have a blow dryer I could grab.
Got about 12 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah, let me mute myself for just a second and use my blow dryer. One aspect of this class that I didn't think through, how we might hit close to the 90-minute mark and my stuff would still be dry here. Okay, I am just gonna grab my blow dryer. As my salt is also still not dry. So that's the other reason I want to use that. So I'm just going to mute myself while I do this. In case I forget to say it though, before I do this, I do not, just as a preference, I do not use a blow dryer on my personal work very often, mostly because I like the natural things that happen when layers dry on their own, but to each their own. And, you know, blow dryer is definitely a good tool. And when you are limited on time.
Does the blow dryer actually impact the result?
Yes, it does. So that's, yeah, one aspect that I wanted to say is that it can, if it's super wet, it can blow things around in a way and create a situation where you've got more striations. And it can also, it can just take away from, like, it could get rid of those pools, it could push your pools around. Um, yeah, it can really affect the way that it dries in a lot of ways. But when it's like this and you just need it to dry faster, like this is mostly dry. I just don't want to do it. The whole point of this is to practice layers drying each layer at a time. So if I were to be impatient and go ahead and do this when it's still a little wet, then I would not be doing the thing I want to show you. Okay, I'm going to mute and blow dry this real quick. Okay, so while I was talking, these were actually drying most of the rest of the way, but I went ahead and did the blow dryer and the salt a little bit here. So that's how that one turned out. I think I like the way this one turned out better. Maybe the pink salt. And I definitely used like table salt for this one. So maybe the table salt, I used salt with big granules too. And this pink salt I have is pretty fine. So definitely the granule size can affect it. Okay, so the next layer I want to do is my red violet on top of this one. And I already have my red violet here. I'm going to add a little bit more red to it. Okay. I'm just painting the red violet layer on top and then resisting the urge to go into it multiple times. And we're just going to see how that looks when it dries. So here's a similar one. And I kind of let some of the blue like peek through there. So that was kind of fun. All right. And then on this one, I'm going to paint a layer of blue. And then we want that layer to dry so that we can do a third layer. And I think we should have enough time to do that. You know what I might do? Well, no. I don't know. I was gonna say maybe I might skip ahead with like a different example I had, but that's okay. Okay, so when I paint my blue on top of this dried yellow, it's going to turn it green, right? If I had done that when that was wet, you wouldn't be able to preserve the yellow underneath. So kind of fun to see that yellow peeking through and just how that affects it doing it that way. All right, and then now I need this layer to be dry, so I am going to mute and use my blow dryer again. Okay, so yeah, you can see using the blow dryer, it definitely like pushed some of my puddles around in ways that maybe wouldn't happen if I let it dry naturally. So it's just, changing the variables a little bit there. But it's not like using a blow dryer is bad or anything. I did state my preference on that, and that's just my preference. Doesn't have to be yours. Okay, so now I'm gonna get a little wash of brown going. You could do this with any three colors that you think might look cool together. It doesn't have to be the same colors as me, and I recommend that you try it out with some different colors so you can see what neat effects you might get. I mean, this would definitely, using these colors, if we were painting grass or a tree, would definitely make for more interesting texture and colors in the grass and the tree, right? Okay, so I've got my brown. And I'm leaving some of the other layers showing through on purpose. All right. So yeah, where the blue and the yellow and the brown all overlap, I get some really fun earthy effects to happen there. And if I had painted those without letting each layer dry, I might not have those same sorts of colors and effects happening. So there's a lot of benefits to letting each layer dry on your watercolor as you go. And then, yeah, if we go back and look at some of these other ones that have been drying while we've been doing these other effects, there's lots of interesting stuff happening here. Like going back to my dry brush with water, I've got a fun effect happening there. So I'd love to see some of y'all's examples. I'm gonna switch to my, oops, that's not what I meant to do. My forward facing camera, and we've got 2 minutes left here. So if you want to hold up your little test sheets, Rich can spotlight you. And then yeah, April, you just rub the salt off when it's dry. April was asking that question. Rich, I'll let you spotlight people so we can.
All right, I'm kind of going through the chat here. We've got so many.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's only giving me a few at a time here. So let's see who we got showing. All right, there's one. All right, Zoe Keller. Let me go ahead and spotlight Zoe here.
Let's
Got
see.
Graciela.
Okay, now I see Zoe's. Yeah, I was spotlighting somebody else for me for a second there. Um, oh, that's really nice, Zoe. Yeah,
Shannon.
the green and yellow. Okay, yeah, look at all. I love the bleeding effects that I'm seeing on Graciella's. And then this is Shannon. Oh, yeah, that dry brush with water. Oh, and your little butterfly. You took my advice with the iridescent on the black. That's really lovely.
All right.
Oh, is that it? Did anybody else? I guess that was it. Oh, I see
That was-
Julie. I'm going to spotlight Julie.
yeah, Julie.
Okay. Oh, yeah, look at that. That's really nice, Julie. I love all those purples and blues.
And we have Sarah.
Oh, okay.
Spotlight Sarah here. Oh,
That's great.
look, we've got.
Replace spotlight, it'll just make one person come up at a time instead of
Ah,
spotlight. Yeah, it'll just make that person full screen for a moment. All right, this is Melissa. Look at that. Lovely. I love all those pinks and blues. Yeah, and those are some lovely flat washes. All of those are really nice and transparent too. Yeah, it's good. The lighter, the better, because you can always make it darker. I always say it's like cutting your bangs or your beard. You can always clip a little bit more. All right, this is Sarah. Lovely, Sarah. Nice to see you. And yeah, that turned out nicely on the cardstock. Your black wash is nice too with the gold.
Dina.
No,
She
little
had hers for a second. There it is.
oh, look, that matches your shirt, Dina. Beautiful. Oh yeah, look at that variegated wash. It's really, really nice. Oh, you can't unmute, so I can't hear you, but those are nice, the ones you're pointing to.
And I think we have Gloria. One more here. Oops. Sorry about that. Here's Gloria.
Ooh, I love those bleedy colors. That's really nice. I can see the restraint you were using there and letting those dry. I can tell just by looking at it, you were being patient. I love to see it.
Awesome.
All right, and if we didn't get a chance to spotlight you, feel free to post them on social media with those hashtags, Make It With Michael's or Michael's Classes, and you can tag me, so I'll be sure to see them. I'm gonna replace my spotlight for myself here. All right, and yeah, next week we'll be sketching the purple passion flower, and that'll be leading up to lost it here. But the so it's a bit of a I think I did label it part one and part two. So part one is uh yeah, actually the more I think about it, it is a part one and part two, and it's for mixed media painting or purple passion flower. But in part one of the class, we're going to be doing the drawing aspect, and then we'll probably get started on the first layers of this mixed media painting in part one, and then keep adding to it in part two, because I spent a little more than 90 minutes on the painting aspect of this, so I want to try to keep it rolling. In the first class, we'll definitely get to the first layers of sketching that flower there. All right, hope to see y'all in those classes coming up in the rest of September. And thank you, Rich, for being such a lovely moderator. And y'all have a great rest of your night.
My pleasure. Have a great afternoon. And if you have any questions, go back and check out the recording on our Michael's YouTube channel, and you can catch anything you missed there. We'll see you next time to check out the purple passion flower. Good
Thank you.
night.
Good night.